Chapter 23, The Militia's Growing Influence in Cult Leadership's Council, Part 5. The massive auditory room was heavy with the scent of incense and the hum of tense energy. An ancient dome-shaped ceiling arched high above, its stonework intricately carved with symbols that had long since lost their meaning to all but the most devoted. Cultists filled the stands, their faces a mixture of apprehension and resolve. They sat in orderly rows, casting expectant gazes toward the stage, where the council of the Sent Ones awaited. The murmurs of the crowd softened as the door at the far end of the room creaked open, and the group entered. Lucas, Mina, Thomas, and Wallace were led to the front of the room, positioned at the base of the council's stage. They stood in formation, waiting for the meeting to begin. The weight of countless eyes on them was almost tangible, but Lucas found his attention drifting inward, to the deepening connection between him and Mina. Their telepathic bond had strengthened since their training began. In moments like this, surrounded by so many strangers and so much uncertainty, it was almost a comfort. He could feel her presence like an echo in his mind, a soft pull at his thoughts. Her emotions, nervousness, resolve, a touch of fear, came through clear as day. He sent back a thought, reaching out to her, trying to calm the growing tightness in her chest. "We'll be fine," he reassured her. "Just stick together." Mina's voice, clear but threaded with unease, rang back in his mind. "I don't like this, Lucas. Something feels off. Why are we here? And why did they summon us now?" His response was filled with a quiet certainty that helped ground her. "We're here to make sure they don't forget what's at stake, to remind them why we're fighting." He felt her nod mentally, though it didn't ease the restlessness in her mind. As the council's members began to rise from their seats, moving to the center of the stage, the room fell silent, the air charged with anticipation. Torgar, the imposing leader of the Sent Ones, stepped forward, his tall, angular figure commanding attention. His dark, weathered features looked down at the crowd with quiet authority, his voice cutting through the silence as he began. "Brothers and sisters," Torgar's voice boomed, strong and unwavering. "The time of waiting has passed. The war is upon us." There was a ripple of quiet murmurs through the crowd, a mix of excitement and fear. Lucas could feel the weight of the words settle over the cultists in waves, each one carrying a different interpretation, a different fear of what was to come. "We stand on the precipice of battle," Torgar continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "The forces of the Unbound press against us, their army swelling with mercenaries and dwarves from across the region. And worse still, the Empire moves in the shadows, watching our every step." Gorla, standing next to Torgar, his short, stocky form almost hidden behind the larger figure of his leader, shifted slightly and added, "We are not alone in this fight. The militias of Brumkaroth grow bolder, their eyes upon us. They know of our presence here, of the non-citizens we shelter. If we are to survive, we must act swiftly and decisively." Mina stiffened at the mention of Brumkaroth. "They're getting closer," she thought to Lucas, her voice tinged with fear. Lucas didn't reply immediately, his mind already racing with the implications of the growing threat. The militia had been an ever-present shadow, lurking just beyond the walls of their headquarters. But this was different. The city was awake to their presence now. If they weren't careful, it would be only a matter of time before the militia came knocking. Torgar's voice cut through the thoughts swirling in Lucas's mind. "Our strength is our unity. We stand together, or we fall. The coming days will test us, but we are not without allies. The cult of the Unbound may have a large army, but they are fractured. We can exploit their weakness if we move quickly." Goldar, who had been sitting in the far corner of the stage, his eyes narrowed with calculation, stepped forward at the mention of the Unbound. "The Unbound are not our only concern," he added. "We must not forget the tension within the city itself. The militia may be unpredictable, and they may come at us with far greater force than we anticipate." The cultists shifted uneasily, murmurs rising again, louder this time. Fear, anxiety, and frustration buzzed through the crowd like static. Lucas felt the ripples of those emotions, their uncertainty pressing against his own. Mina's thoughts were louder than usual, filled with sharp, anxious questions. What will we do if they attack? What if they arrest us all? Lucas reached out mentally, his thoughts strong and steady. We fight. We prepare. We survive. A cold silence fell over the room as Torgar raised his hand for quiet. The council seemed to shift into a more formal position, as if acknowledging the weight of the discussion. Torgar looked down at the party, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. "I have brought you here," he said, addressing the party now, "because your role in this war is vital. The power you possess, the abilities you have honed, are no longer a mere curiosity. You are our future." Mina stiffened, the unease in her thoughts sharpening. "I don't like the way he's looking at us." Lucas met her gaze, trying to calm her, though his own heart was racing. The implications of what Torgar said, what it meant for them, it was starting to feel too real, too close. Torgar's voice rang out again. "You will be trained further in the coming days. The war is upon us. The time for hesitation is over." As the council began to lay out their plans, Lucas and Mina shared another silent exchange, the tension between them palpable. The deepening bond they had formed made the weight of the moment more intense, their shared thoughts a constant undercurrent in the room. "We're in this together," Lucas thought, though he didn't know if he was trying to convince Mina or himself. And with that, the room fell into a tense quiet, the enormity of the task ahead beginning to take shape, the fate of the cult and the city hanging in the balance. The days following the council's meeting were tense, filled with barely contained anxiety. Lucas, Mina, Thomas, and Wallace had little time to process what had been discussed before they were thrust into the chaos of a rapidly escalating situation. The city of Brumkaroth was beginning to stir, its streets buzzing with whispers of cults and resistance. The air was thick with the scent of conflict, both physical and political, and the militia's presence grew more palpable with each passing hour. Around the HQ, the cultists, who had once carried themselves with the quiet confidence of a hidden power, now moved with more caution. There was an underlying sense of paranoia, a constant awareness of the eyes upon them. Lucas could feel it all, tension curling in his chest, the weight of every glance, every whispered word. It was as if the city itself was closing in, preparing for something that none of them were fully ready for. The first skirmish broke out on the outskirts of the district, just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in a hazy orange. The cult of the Sent Ones had just finished a small briefing on the tactical situation when a distant shout echoed through the alleyways. It was a signal. The cult of the Unbound had sent their mercenaries to provoke a confrontation. The clash was swift, fists and blades meeting with the sharp cry of steel against steel. But it was over almost as soon as it had begun. The militia, as if waiting for the right moment, swooped in with their heavily armored forces, breaking up the fight with a decisive show of force. Lucas watched from the balcony of the HQ as the cultists were rounded up by the militia. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and the fight had left a bad taste in his mouth. He could feel Mina's thoughts swirling with unease, her frustration and anger mixing with a growing sense of helplessness. "It's only going to get worse," Mina's voice echoed in his mind. "We can't keep hiding like this. Not with them." She hesitated, her next thought a sharp, bitter sting. "Not with them hunting us down." Lucas tightened his grip on the railing. He couldn't deny it. The militia was already tightening their grip on the city, and it was clear that they were no longer willing to tolerate the presence of the non-citizens the cult had taken in. Every confrontation, no matter how small, was a step toward something larger, a war neither side seemed ready for. The following days brought more skirmishes, each one more violent and more intense than the last. The cult of the Sent Ones had learned to avoid direct confrontations with the militia, but that didn't stop the violence from spilling into the streets. Small flash fights erupted frequently, often sparked by minor provocations or misunderstandings between factions. And yet, each time, the same pattern played out. The cultists would clash with their enemies, only to be broken up by the militia before they could gain any real ground. It was a game of cat and mouse, each side testing the other's limits, feeling each other out like predators in the dark. But the militia was too well organized, too well equipped. The cults could only strike in the shadows, their attacks always short-lived, always snuffed out by the sudden arrival of Brumkaroth's enforcers. Lucas could feel the strain in Mina's thoughts as the days wore on. She was growing restless, her instincts pulling her toward something she couldn't quite define. Her fears, already heightened by the cult's role in the growing conflict, now melded with frustration at their inability to act. This can't go on forever, she thought, her frustration seeping through her words like a crack in a dam. They won't stop. Not until we're gone, or until this place burns to the ground. Lucas couldn't answer right away. His mind was too occupied with their situation, too wrapped up in the feeling of impending doom that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. But he knew that Mina was right. If they didn't act soon, they would lose more than just their safety. They would lose everything they had fought for. The tipping point came on the third day of these flash fights, when a skirmish erupted outside the gates of the HQ. This time it wasn't just the militia that intervened. Brumkaroth's forces had grown bolder, more brazen. The militia's numbers swelled, joined by guardsmen from the city's elite forces. The first group of cultists trying to escape the conflict was cut down swiftly. A few managed to retreat back into the HQ, but the militia wasn't far behind. The time for subtlety was over. Mina's voice was loud in his mind. "We need to help them, Lucas. They're cornered." Without thinking, he nodded to her, and without another word, the two of them broke from the group, rushing toward the front gates. They were met with a wall of heat and tension as the militia descended, their armor glinting in the midday sun, blocking any hope of escape. The chaos was immediate. Lucas barely had time to react before a mercenary from the Unbound, a hulking figure clad in dark steel, charged toward him, a heavy axe raised high. The man swung down with all his might, but Lucas, his reflexes honed from his training with Mina, ducked just in time. The force of the blow shattered the stone behind him. "Watch out!" Mina's voice was in his head again, urgent. Before Lucas could respond, a smaller cultist dashed forward, engaging the mercenary with a flurry of punches. He was quick, agile, but outmatched. With a powerful kick, the mercenary sent the cultist flying across the courtyard. Mina was already moving, her enhanced speed and agility allowing her to close the distance between them in an instant. In a blur, she struck, her foot connecting with the mercenary's knee, sending him staggering backward. The mercenary raised his axe to strike, but before he could, Lucas reached out, using his telekinesis to hurl a nearby stone at his head, knocking him out cold. "Go, go!" Mina shouted, her voice tinged with urgency. "We need to move. More are coming." Lucas felt a rush of adrenaline as the militia began to close in on them. The sudden realization that they had crossed a line, no longer simply fighting for survival, but drawing the attention of everyone, set his pulse racing. This is it, Lucas thought, his mind racing with possibilities. We can't go back now. And yet, despite the chaos around them, despite the danger that lurked at every corner, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the true battle had yet to come. Lucas and Mina rushed back into the HQ, their boots pounding against the stone floors, each step echoing in the tense air. The shouts and clashing of steel still rang in their ears, but the heavy doors of the HQ slammed shut behind them, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The chaos of the streets seemed far away, muffled by the thick walls and the urgency of the moment. Inside, the rest of the cultists were already on high alert. The briefing from earlier had done little to prepare them for this. Everyone knew that the militia's presence had been growing, but the true extent of the danger had never felt as real as it did now. The cultists were rallying, pulling their weapons from hidden stashes, readying themselves for whatever came next. Lucas met Mina's gaze, the tension between them palpable. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of frustration, fear, and determination. He could feel the weight of it all, the anxiety hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. His own mind raced with the knowledge that the situation was spiraling out of control, and they were at the center of it all. We need to be ready, Lucas thought, his voice clear in her mind. But we can't fight everyone at once. We don't have a choice, Mina replied, her thoughts tinged with frustration. We can't let them tear everything apart. We have to protect the cult, protect the people who are counting on us. Before Lucas could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Cultists and mercenaries alike were gathering in the central chamber, and the tension in the air thickened. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The brief respite of silence was over. It was time to face the storm. The door creaked open, and Torgar, Gorla, and Goldar entered, their expressions grim. Their presence alone seemed to elevate the tension in the room. The three of them had been part of the council earlier, but now, with the situation in the streets growing worse, their focus had shifted entirely to the immediate threat at hand. "We need to move quickly," Torgar said, his voice deep and steady. "The militia will be here soon, and they won't stop until we're all in chains. We need a plan." Goldar nodded. "We've been expecting this, but not on this scale. The Unbound's involvement complicates matters. They'll be just as eager to see us fall." Mina's pulse quickened as she glanced toward Lucas. They had been ready for a fight, but the enormity of it was settling in now. The militia was growing, and with them the pressure to choose sides had never been clearer. "We'll need to divide our forces," Gorla suggested. "If we're going to hold them off long enough for the citizens to get out, we need to keep them busy. Let's take the fight to the streets before they can get organized." Thomas, who had been pacing the room, stepped forward. His face was set, his eyes burning with the focus that had come to define him over the past weeks. "What about the Unbound? They're as much a threat as the militia. They won't just let us walk out of here." "They'll be dealt with," Torgar replied sharply, his gaze lingering on Thomas for a moment before returning to the group. "But first, we hold our ground. Our survival depends on unity. If we fracture, if we bicker amongst ourselves—" His eyes swept over the room, catching everyone's gaze. "Then the city will eat us alive." Goldar raised a hand. "The militia's forces are already massing outside the gates. The longer we wait, the more of them will be here." Lucas could feel the building pressure, the urgency that was settling like a weight in his chest. The chaos outside was only growing, and the plan to hold the HQ was no longer an option. The time for strategy had passed. The militia was ready to pounce at any moment. "We need to create a diversion," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Something to buy us time. We need to get the citizens out, too. If the militia moves in and sees that the people are safe, they may hesitate." Mina nodded, her thoughts in agreement with his. "We'll have to move fast, but the militia's going to want to arrest everyone, not just the cultists." Torgar's expression tightened, and he began issuing orders to the other cultists. "Focus on protecting the innocents. The militia will prioritize them, and once they're distracted, we'll make our move." Outside, the sounds of fighting grew louder, more intense. The militia was closing in, but not yet in position. The first wave of cultists, led by a handful of mercenaries from the Unbound, had already spilled into the streets, exchanging blows with militia soldiers. The sounds of clashing metal, shouts, and the occasional scream filled the air. "They're coming," Mina thought, her focus narrowing as she tried to take in everything around her. Lucas shared her thoughts and felt the rush of adrenaline that came with the knowledge that the time had come. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "We need to hold them off long enough to let the citizens escape," he thought, the weight of his role in all of this heavy in his chest. "But if we get trapped here—" Mina's hand brushed his arm, grounding him. "We'll get through this. We have to. Together." Lucas met her gaze, a silent agreement passing between them. There was no turning back. They had come too far, and they wouldn't let everything fall apart now. Outside, the first wave of militia soldiers had begun to march toward the HQ, their numbers growing rapidly. Cultists clashed with mercenaries, and the air was thick with the scent of smoke and burning metal. The battle had begun in earnest, but the militia was still not in position. They were still maneuvering, positioning their soldiers to cut off the cultists' escape routes. The street was a battleground, and the sound of combat reverberated through the air. Mina and Lucas turned to the rest of the group, their minds in sync as they prepared for what came next. There was no time to waste. The city was on the edge of a cliff, and the only way to avoid the fall was to stand firm. "You know what to do," Lucas said to the group, his voice firm, his mind steady. "We hold the line, protect the civilians, and buy ourselves time. We'll deal with the militia when they're ready." The cultists nodded, their expressions hardening in determination. The time for hesitation was over. They would fight to protect what little they had left. With one last glance between them, Lucas and Mina turned and stepped into the street, their feet pounding against the cobblestones as the battle raged all around them. The chaos of the street grew louder with every passing second. The first wave of militia soldiers had arrived, their armor gleaming in the pale daylight as they marched toward the HQ, their swords drawn and eyes sharp. They were disciplined, a stark contrast to the anarchic clashes between the cult of the Sent Ones and the unbound mercenaries. The militia knew how to fight, but they were not prepared for the ferocity that came with desperation. Lucas and Mina stood side by side at the edge of the courtyard, just outside the HQ's grand doors. The tension in the air was thick, the only sounds their steady breathing and the clanging of metal in the distance. Behind them, the rest of the cultists readied themselves. Some were calm, their minds focused on the task at hand. Others were visibly rattled by the magnitude of the conflict. Lucas could feel the jittery energy of fear coursing through them, but he pushed it aside. This was no time for doubt. "It's coming," Lucas thought, his mind connected to Mina's in a near-perfect harmony. "We hold them here. We keep the civilians safe. We don't let the militia push us back." Mina squeezed his hand, the only tangible reminder of the bond they shared. She had been his anchor through everything, and even now in the heart of battle, she was his strength. "We'll fight. Together." The first clash happened at the intersection of two narrow streets. Cultists and mercenaries collided with the militia's front lines in a burst of violence. A moment later, the militia struck back, their formation designed to overwhelm the cultists with sheer numbers. They were organized, cold, and brutal. Mina and Lucas both felt the shift in the atmosphere as the battle intensified. The militia's arrival had shifted the dynamics entirely. What had been a chaotic skirmish between factions was now a full-scale war, and the stakes were higher than ever. "We need to push them back," Torgar said, his voice gruff. The towering figure of the cult leader was hard to miss as he strode past the group, his mind filled with military strategy. "Form a line and make them break it. Use the narrow streets to our advantage. Don't give them room to spread." The cultists moved quickly, falling into formation as the mercenaries surged forward. Lucas felt the rush of adrenaline through his veins, the sense of urgency overwhelming any lingering doubts. He had trained for this, alongside Mina, and now they had to put their skills to use. But as the front lines clashed, the scope of the battle only became more apparent. The militia was well coordinated, their soldiers skilled in both combat and crowd control. They were pushing in from all sides, systematically trying to contain the chaos. For a moment, it seemed like the cultists might hold, but then the militia began to push harder, forcing the cult back. Lucas felt the shift, an overwhelming surge of pressure, and that's when the first wave of reinforcements arrived. Soldiers flooded into the streets, marching with precision as they began to encircle the cultists and their allies. It was a strategic move, one meant to trap them and force a surrender. Mina's breath was sharp as she scanned the battlefield. Her thoughts flickered rapidly, calculating their next move. "We can't hold this forever. If we don't make a stand, we'll get pushed back. The militia's reinforcements are coming faster than expected." Lucas could hear her thoughts as clearly as his own. "We need to split them up. Focus on cutting their lines before they can fully surround us." Mina's eyes narrowed. "Let's break through," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "We need to find a gap." The cultists around them moved in unison as Mina led the charge. Lucas followed, his pyrokinesis sparking to life in an instant. Flames erupted from his hands, lighting the path in front of them as they advanced. The militia hesitated for a moment as the fire spread, but it wasn't enough to stop their relentless push. They were coming for the cultists, and their numbers only seemed to multiply. Mina was a blur beside him, darting through the chaos with lightning speed, her every move calculated to avoid the militia's strikes and take down their rear guard. With every strike, with every step she took, Lucas felt the pull of her strength, and the connection between them deepened. They moved like a single unit, anticipating each other's actions without words, their bond made stronger by their training. In the distance, he saw Thomas, his massive frame cutting through the lines with brutal efficiency. His sword cleaved through enemy soldiers with every swing, his broad shield protecting cultists from the militia's assaults. Thomas had become a tower of defense, his every move a calculated step to protect the weaker members of the cult. But even his strength couldn't hold the tide forever. "We need to end this," Lucas said through their bond, his words sharp and focused. "If we don't push them back now, we'll lose the upper hand." But as he said those words, a roar erupted from behind him. The Unbound had joined the fray, their mercenaries surging into the battle with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. They were not content to sit back and watch the militia crush the cult. They had their own stake in the outcome, and they were making their move. For a brief moment, Lucas could feel a flicker of hesitation from Mina. The Unbound mercenaries were unpredictable at best, and their presence on the battlefield would only complicate matters. But Lucas couldn't afford to waste time. He forced his mind to stay focused. "We have to keep moving, Mina. We're not out of this yet." Mina nodded sharply, her face set in determination. "Let's go." Together, they pushed forward, slicing through the mercenaries as the cultists rallied behind them. But even as they advanced, the militia pressed harder, closing in from all directions. The narrow streets were becoming a trap, and it was becoming clear that the militia was trying to corral them into a corner. "Fall back!" Torgar's voice rang out over the din of battle. "Everyone fall back to the HQ. We can't keep them off for much longer." But even as the call for retreat echoed, it became clear that the militia's reinforcements were closing in too fast. There was no longer any room to maneuver, no space left to breathe. The cultists were being forced into a final stand, and their options were dwindling. Lucas could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. The civilians needed to be evacuated, but time was running out. The militia wasn't here to just suppress the cult. They were here to crush them. And with the Unbound now in the mix, the lines between ally and enemy had become dangerously blurred. "We have to survive this," Lucas thought, feeling a deep, primal instinct to protect those around him. Mina's thoughts were sharp as ever. "We will. Together." And then, just as the militia closed in, a massive explosion rang out from the direction of the marketplace, rocking the very foundation of the city. The explosion had shaken the very ground beneath their feet, a thunderous shockwave that sent debris flying in all directions. The blinding flash of light was followed by a cloud of smoke and dust, obscuring the battlefield for precious moments. For a heartbeat, everything came to a standstill. Then the chaos resumed. Lucas's heart raced as he spun around, his instincts urging him to assess the situation. The streets were bathed in the acrid scent of smoke and burning debris, and the battlefield had been momentarily fractured by the explosion. But as the smoke began to clear, it became painfully clear that the militia and the Unbound were regrouping, both sides ready to continue their siege. The cultists had no time to waste. "Fall back! Now!" Torgar shouted again, his voice filled with urgency. He was already moving, his towering figure cutting through the fray as he led his followers toward the HQ. The cultists scrambled to follow, many of them wounded, their focus split between fighting and retreating. Mina moved with lightning speed, ducking under a soldier's swing, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Lucas could feel the heat of her presence in his mind, the focus of their shared bond as clear as ever. Despite the violence, they were still together. And that made all the difference. "Stay close," Lucas whispered to her, his thoughts a steady current in her mind. He didn't need to say much more. They both knew what was at stake. They had to protect each other, protect the cultists, and protect the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. The militia had now split into smaller groups, fanning out to block the escape routes. Soldiers moved swiftly, organizing with military precision to secure the perimeter. From their vantage point near the HQ, Lucas could see the tight lines forming, their shields raised as they began to surround the cultists on all sides. But the cult was not without its own power. Torgar and Gorla were shouting orders, directing their followers to create defensive lines and focus their energy on repelling the advancing forces. The Unbound mercenaries, ever unpredictable, were now beginning to retreat as well. though not without a few parting shots aimed at the militia soldiers they deemed most vulnerable. And through it all, Lucas felt the presence of Thomas, his mind a bastion of resolve amidst the confusion. The towering figure of the warrior stood at the edge of the battle, his sword raised high, cutting down anyone who came too close. His protective instincts were in full force, keeping anyone who could not fight safe from harm. But there was little time left. The militia would only grow stronger, and the cultists were quickly becoming fewer in number. A sudden shout broke through Lucas's thoughts. "We have to go now!" Torgar's voice rang out from across the courtyard. He had spotted something, a formation of militia soldiers moving in from the north. This was their final chance to escape. With a surge of adrenaline, Lucas moved. He reached out to Mina through their telepathic bond, feeling her presence near him as they charged forward. The world around them seemed to slow, the distant sounds of battle fading into a blur as they raced toward the rear of the HQ. The cultists followed behind them, running through the streets, trying to escape the overwhelming pressure of the militia's forces. Lucas could feel the pain of his people, the fear and exhaustion, but he pushed it all away. There was no room for hesitation now. Mina was at his side, her breath steady as she sliced through the air with the precision only she could achieve. Her speed was an advantage in moments like these, where every second counted. She darted between soldiers, creating small openings for the others to follow, and Lucas was right behind her, his telekinesis controlling the flow of the battlefield. "Keep moving," Mina shouted to the cultists who lagged behind. "We're almost there." But just as they were nearing the edge of the street, a voice rang out from behind them, sharp and commanding. "Halt!" A group of militia soldiers had blocked the path ahead, their shields raised and their spears pointed directly at the cultists. There was nowhere to run. Lucas felt the pressure building, the walls closing in around them. The militia's numbers were overwhelming, and with the unbound retreating, they had no reinforcements left. And then the sound of clanging armor echoed from the far side of the street. More soldiers, their formation tighter than ever. The cultists were trapped. "We don't have much time," Torgar muttered, his voice low. "Prepare yourselves for the worst." Lucas's mind raced. The battle was not over. They had to find a way to survive. He reached out to Mina, his thoughts sharp. "We need a way out. Do you see anything?" Mina scanned the area, her gaze flicking from side to side. Her intuition was sharp, and she felt the pulse of danger radiating from every corner of the street. But then her eyes locked onto something, a narrow alleyway hidden behind a series of crumbling buildings. "There," she whispered. "We can take that alley. It'll lead us to the eastern gate." Lucas nodded, signaling to the others to follow him. Without hesitation, the group turned and charged toward the alleyway, their path obstructed by the looming presence of the militia soldiers. But just as they reached the mouth of the alley, a spear flew through the air, narrowly missing Lucas's side. The cultists yelled, ducking into the shadows as more soldiers gave chase. The militia had caught on, and they were determined to stop them at all costs. With the alleyway now compromised, the situation was more desperate than ever. And that's when the first arrest came. The militia had managed to capture Goldar. His broad form was now surrounded by a dozen soldiers, each of them holding his limbs in tight grip as they dragged him away from the main group. "Goldar!" Torgar shouted, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. But the militia had no interest in his cries. They had captured one of the key leaders, and they were not about to let him escape. Lucas's mind spun. Goldar was a key figure in the cult of the Sent Ones. His capture would have dire consequences for the future of their people. Torgar's gaze flickered between the soldiers and the retreating cultists. There was nothing they could do. Goldar's fate was sealed, and with it, the uncertainty of the cult's future grew ever more pressing. The cultists had no choice but to retreat into the shadows, leaving behind the battlefield and their fate in the hands of the militia. They had lost a key figure, and with it, their hopes for a decisive victory seemed to slip away. As the cultists vanished into the alleys, Lucas could feel the weight of the moment. The future of their cause now lay in the hands of those who would be judged by Goldar's fate, and the war, it seemed, had only just begun.